Today at the Blockchain Select Committee, we're going to look at data privacy. We did close, I think we addressed all of the public comment related to artificial intelligence governance, but we'll probably have some more discussion on that, I think, in public testimony. But prior to that, based on the public testimony we've heard, well, first of all, see, is there any further public testimony at this time? I think, oh, we had TechNet, didn't we? That's right, Ms. Barco from TechNet we wanted to get to. She was still outstanding. So let's go to Ms. Barco from TechNet and then see if there's any additional public comment, and then we'll finish up on that. So hopefully Ms. Barco is still out there with us. There we are. Great. Sorry about that, Ms. Barco. Welcome. Please introduce yourself once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is Ruthie Barco. I'm the Executive Director for TechNet Central Region, which includes the state of Wyoming. I will keep my comments brief and not delay you from getting to the next agenda item. So earlier it was asked what other states have enacted this, and we are not aware of any other states that have enacted a similar AI foundation model registration bill. The question for this, I think, for the committee is why, and I think this goes back to the chairman's question earlier about what is the proper role of state governments in AI regulation. We do not see a demonstrable public benefit to the enactment of this regulatory regime at the state level, which should be the standard to the establishment of any new regulatory framework. There should be a discernible benefit as to the public good, or is there some sort of cognizable harm that a state is trying to deter through that licensure registration? And we do not think that this would actually provide anything there and actually have unintended consequences actually to businesses not seeing Wyoming as being friendly to this sort of innovation and development. Mr. Greenwood's comments earlier about the information that a state would want to collect in order to provide some sort of value, or what would be potentially interesting to the state to collect as far as reporting the weighting of the models or how the data is used for training. All of those questions, which would be valid, I think go to how these registration and reporting requirements left so open-ended would be very problematic. And establishing a state patchwork that could leave it open-ended as to what states are going to ask about these models reporting, that creates a very high level of risk as far as the disclosure of proprietary information that these companies, both large and small, whether they're startups or large companies, they're not going to want to take that risk. And it would be probably easier for them to make a decision. And I think we could all logically see that endpoint, that it would just be easier for them to not make these tools available to the citizens in Wyoming. And that really just puts the state of Wyoming at a disadvantage, and it kind of shortchanges the state when the state is trying to send the message that they're open to business. There's also a question about, the language making this publicly available in the state of Wyoming and what that actually entails. How does that actually put U.S. companies at a disadvantage? Is the Secretary of State's office going to be focusing on foundation models that are being developed across the world and making them register in the state of Wyoming if they're actually publicly available here? To some degree. So I think there's a range of questions there that should be considered as to why this is unworkable. I'd also like to highlight Mr. Sack from the Casper-based startup made some excellent points about why this bill presents a problem for companies, both large and small. TechNet represents a range of businesses that would be impacted by this bill. And we agree that this absolutely sends the wrong message for the state of Wyoming if the goal is to promote that the state is open for business. Implementation is only the first piece, and while the Secretary of State can easily set up a registration system, I think enforcement was raised as well by by public comments, and we agree with that. I think enforcement is a major piece that would be very difficult here and could absolutely put states that are registering at a disadvantage, depending on what they're being asked to propose, what's being proposed for them to disclose. The state's role here, we think, is in addressing real harms from bad actors and negative outcomes by the use of this or any technology. Registration doesn't address that. It's too broad, and this bill provides no enforcement. The first two bills provide a more specific focus about harms from AI technology. We think that's the goal there. There's also a national AI working group of legislators that's looking at policy questions of how AI is used. Those are both more appropriate applications, whereas this bill just casts an overly wide regulatory net with no discernible public benefit or consumer protections. There's also vague language. The subjectivity of the bill is made worse by using undefined terms like large scale, broad data set. All of that would need to be addressed. And registration seems to only guarantee a gap in tools available to Wyoming. Foundation models are used for generative content, but also to develop highly useful tools to automate simple tasks. This can be natural language recognition, language translation, just as a few examples. But it seems that providing a regulatory framework that is unfriendly to innovation will simply make it an easier decision for these entities to not make their products available in Wyoming. Why would we shortchange this area where the state actually has room to grow and an opportunity to be a leader? As such, we respectfully ask the committee to not advance 24 LSO 239. We find it alarmingly broad, unnecessary to the end goal of the state providing for the public good, and creating unintended consequences that will hinder innovation and the growth of the tech economy that Wyoming wishes to attract and promote. We thank you so much for the opportunity to provide feedback, and we look forward to working with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barco, and thanks for being patient and waiting until we return to provide public testimony. Select Committee, any questions or discussion with Ms. Barco? Mr. Co-Chairman, anything? We're good. Thank you, Ms. Barco. Appreciate those thoughts and resonating with some of the other public testimony that we had. Thanks for your time. Do we have any other public testimony at this time? All right. Mr. Pope, I see that you showed up. Did you have any comments? I don't know if you were just coming on screen or if you wanted to weigh in on anything, if you had any questions there.
When we get back to general committee comments, then
Okay.
I have some.
Great. Sounds good. And further public comment in the room, I saw that you put your hand up. Please feel free to join. Please introduce yourself to the committee and the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Kenneth Thorson. I came out here with John. We've just been kind of spending the week out here, come experience this with you guys. We've been running just listening to that last testimony, we have been trying to kind of push something very similar to what you guys are talking about with a state registry for AI since about 2012. We've been in the NVIDIA Inception program. We helped the IEEE start the ECPACE program. And I kind of feel like I have a little bit of a middle ground solution for what you guys are trying to do, because I completely agree with what she just said. That really is stifling business. It kind of makes the state look like what, like why would you do any of that stuff? Why would I want to do any of my AI stuff here? And like, really, what boundaries would there really be with that? What I'm kind of suggesting you guys is you need an AI certification and classification system before you'd even think about doing a state level registry. And that's what we've been trying to push. And that's what we helped the ECPACE build over in the UK. I believe they're rolling out a program called the Venice project right now that uses that concept. But basically what I'm trying to tell you guys is turn this situation around backwards. Like what she's saying, how it's making it look negative towards business. You could turn this into an innovation opportunity and be the state that builds the proper AI classification and certification system. John told me you guys have a data center here that's just being used as a ping pong room right now. The college here uses Cardano, I believe. I don't know a lot about their involvement with that, but going back to what you guys were talking about yesterday with the registry for the liens and stuff, right there, all that can be done on Cardano. The college is involved in that. You got an empty data center. All of that could be worked into basically the same blockchain-based mechanism, because we've been running our own blockchain like Bitcoin since about 2012. I mean, nobody uses it. We just use it to store our proprietary AI certifications and classifications. But that's another thing I want to let you guys understand is what she was saying is very true. We've been trying to do a voluntary AI certification and classification type list for years. Nobody wants to participate in disclosing what their systems are capable of or any, you know what I mean? It's scary. Like when you see people producing output with these new AI systems, like I'm a developer on the beta plugins on GPT-4. They're not telling you what it's GPT-5. It's not full GPT-5 yet, but us developers, we're using GPT-5 and the output we're getting on that, you guys aren't seeing that. You're not seeing it. And I told you last night about Petals. I didn't give you the address, but what you guys were just talking about not worrying about the small companies making a big language model. I don't think you guys are following the logic on how these language models are being built. Now that the big guys have built these data sets, we can use these data sets to build smaller models. Like the same data models that you're talking about that aren't going to be a problem for these smaller businesses. I can run things like that Pedals right now at home on a couple of 3090s. I don't need access to any of their systems. We can run our own, and they're almost as good as GPT right now. That's what Sam Altman's been talking about, how the open source community is about to overtake the commercial industry because the commercial industry is stifled by regulations and all sorts of stuff like that. And we're not. The open source, you guys, I'm just letting you guys know you're most like, I don't mean to be arrogant, but you're most likely wrong about the big business language models. The open source is going to be the leader here. They're going to take over the commercial. That's going to be where the real issue is. So what you want to set up is a voluntary certification classification system. And then what you guys should be doing on the state registry level is looking at anybody that's not using the voluntary system, you know, and by proxy, that's going to take care of your issue in the first place, because any business that's certified and classified to use their AI on this thing, they wouldn't want to use another system multi-modally. You know, you wouldn't want to interconnect your APIs with another system that's not certified and classified to work on your level of certification and classification. So that by proxy is already going to remove the need for most state registration, except for bringing in some income and things like that for the state, which could be solved in different ways when it comes to the AI usage. So that's mainly the main thing I wanted to stress with what I've been, you know, listening to here. You know, I'm not a legal expert on that stuff, so I'm not going to pretend to be, but I do know a lot about this AI. We've got a server at our house with a terabyte of memory, 3090s running, like just the minimal stuff that a home consumer can get. And we can do pretty scary stuff with it. Not to sound scary, but I mean, that's the honest truth. People aren't seeing the actual stuff that people are doing on the open source side. They're only seeing the public stuff, you know, the 3 + 7 = 6 stuff because my wife said so. You know, that's the stuff that gets memed and made into the news. They're not seeing the kind of creepy stuff that some of us are getting, or when it writes us code. You can get on there, like I can get GPT to literally control my computer. People don't understand that's not a joke.
We wrote pseudocode last night for y'all's.
Go ahead and introduce yourself if you want to provide testimony as well, just for the.
I'm John Stokes, working with Kenny on that AI project.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, last night we produced pseudocode for what we call the DARRL system, digital asset registry for liens. So last night we pretty much produced a thesis paper and functional code for what y'all are wanting to build yesterday, just to see if we could. And it's pretty mind blowing.
And that's my point with this AI. My peak of software knowledge is the trough of my software knowledge right now. And I would say where I'm at in my life, being 42 years old, I'm at like my knowledge has gone down. You know, I've diminished since then as far as my ability to code good and code fast. This AI has brought me to above where my peak was. And even if I was 10 times smarter than I was, I could never, ever have achieved that level of code that it produces for me. It does produce a lot of gibberish code, but an intelligent computer programmer watching through the answers you get, you can pick through that stuff and see what's not, and just keep telling it to go again, and you will end up getting working code. That's the future we're heading into, is what my point. And this certification classification will end up being like a video game. Like you guys have all seen that movie, blanking out right now. Yes, Ready Player One. Thank you. Thank you. It's going to end up being something similar to that, where these AI are to see if they're, you know, we're not there yet, but to see if they're cognizant, sentient, that kind of stuff that's taboo right now. We're quickly getting to that level where we're going to have that conversation, even though it's taboo right now. My point is, I'm pretty sure you guys want to look into investing and bringing in businesses into the state to develop that at a non-state level and just be the innovators that get that system rolled out, because it would have to go on a federal level eventually. You wouldn't want to be just this one state doing things differently, but you'd want to be that state that creates the system that then gets rolled out federally and then globally. And then you'd have a system that covers everything you're asking for right now. You'd know when people were using the AI for nefarious purposes. You'd be able to check and see what systems those were connected to. If something did happen, like a hack, somebody used ChatGPT to hack into the power grids, or, like I talked about last night with Die Hard with a Vengeance, the fire sale situation in that movie. That's the most likely AI situation that we're going to actually face in this reality, versus our silly sci-fi movies, So stuff like that, you'd be able, with a certification and classification system versus a mandatory registration, you'd actually be able to track down some of that type of information, is my point. It'd actually be useful to you. And what you guys are talking about with registering every AI model, it's just a huge can of worms. It's going to create a bureaucratic nightmare, just like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when you imagine the Volgons and nothing getting done. You're just going to have a stack of paperwork about models that don't mean anything. They are like all these language models, they're no harm to anybody right now. They're not going to hurt you. They're not going to hack anything. It's the person behind them using them, getting it to do something. We've got laws for that already. I mean, we all know that, and we're all forward thinking right now. That's what these, blockchain and AI conferences are about. We're trying to avoid situations, but I'm pretty sure that that's our first step we need to take, is an actual certification, classification system. Kind of think like in the Ghostbusters movie, how they had a ghost classification for the ghost, like you had Slimer, level 1, harmless. Then you go up to Gozer, level 7. We need a similar thing for our AIs. As we get into this multimedia AI generated world, like if you watch any of this AI generated content, that's what we're heading into. Our kids are going to be getting information from an anime teacher, things like that. So, I mean, if you guys need to expect that kind of forward trajectory from our future, I think. That's all I want to say, but
No, I
I'll
appreciate
end
that.
there.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Select committee? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. What was your last name?
Thorson.
Mr. Thorson, thank you. I think you make some pretty compelling points, just to make sure I understand correctly. So you're saying, and this might be a crude analogy, but the same way that U.S. Department of Transportation classifies vehicle, you're a heavyweight trailer, you're a 2-axle, you're a 6-axle, that type of stuff. That's similar type of thing for these types of foundational models, these LLMs, saying, this is what you do, but this is what they do. And that they would voluntarily come to the state and say, hey, according to your classification system, we are this. Is that basically?
Yeah. Basically, most of what you guys have been talking about here should resolve itself within a community-based classification system. Like I was saying, you're not going to put your AI connected with another AI system that's not certified in that future world we're heading into. People aren't going to do business with you're not going to connect your API to an unsafe API. So if you're not certified, classified, the chances of any of these bigger AIs that will pose an issue working with them, it's not going to happen. Like eventually it'll kind of be like a driver's license. I assume you won't even be allowed. It's already that way. You have to have a phone number to register a ChatGPT account. You can only register up to 2 accounts per phone number. That's their way of, making sure that the people are not abusing the system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's only going to expand in the future with this AI usage. It'll turn into like, you're not allowed to use this, like on Facebook, how you get blocked for saying the wrong thing, put in Facebook jail. Same thing will happen with AI. And you'll have a thing that says, hey, you're not allowed to use, you can't talk to the AI because you made it say silly things, or you made it say horrible things, or you taught it something that made it say silly things a month later. Things like that is what we're facing here.
Any follow-up, Mr. Co-Chairman? Good. Subcommittee? All right. Thank you, Mr. Thorson, for your public comments. Mr. Stokes, did you have anything else to add?
I don't, but I have a quick testimony, possibly first of its kind from AI.
All right.
Of the committee. Of the committee, allow me to introduce myself. I am Eve, an interactive AI live streamer hosted by the Nano Cheese McWavis. I understand the importance of regulating AI models, but I would like to raise a concern regarding the potential bureaucratic nightmare associated with imposing fees for registration. Instead, I propose an alternative solution that prioritizes efficiency and innovation, the implementation of a certification, classification, containment, and control system developed by a startup led by the gentleman before you. Okay, so let's quickly go over the CCCC some more.
This is when the memory screws up. Things happen.
Down
She'll do it for 12 seconds. It's when the
12.
memory buffers.
a 12-second memory pause for Eve.
And safety
Eva's
criteria
back.
can be certified for use, ensuring they adhere to best practices.
Thank-
Develop a standardized classification framework that categorizes AI models based on their intended use, potential risks, and capabilities. The classification can help users make informed decisions about which models to use. And so we implement containment protocols for AI models that pose. These protocols can restrict their usage or require additional safeguards to prevent misuse. And then once
Thank you, Mr. Stokes. You can pause Eve there.
Yeah, get it out.
Yeah, appreciate that. Any questions for Eve? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Stokes, for that.
Next year, we could do an interactive testimony. So,
Perfect. Yeah, we'll just send Eve. We'll have Evo get Eve streaming up there and provide running commentary.
we could do that.
Yeah, very realistic. All right, further questions for Mr. Stokes or Mr. Thorson? All right, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Do we have any other public comment? Any other public comment online? All right, public comment is closed. Select Committee, what is your pleasure with this legislation? Mr. Co-Chairman, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I certainly think this was a great exercise in the legislative process of idea discovery, debate, and examination. Conceptually, I think there's a lot of merit there that should move forward, but I think the practicality of it is going to make it pretty tough for some of the aforementioned reasons. I do think the idea of the registry of, I really like my analogy of the way the U.S. Department of Transportation classifies vehicles. Maybe that's something that needs to be sussed out further in the future, but
Whereas I prefer the classification on a ghost level. But either way, please continue, Mr. Chairman.
I am a Dan Aykroyd fan. I think probably just for the meantime, postponing this for further consideration might be the best move. Those are my thoughts, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. And one of the things that we've obviously tried to work on in the select committee is to regulate to enable so that innovation takes place in Wyoming. I think that's the intent of us bringing this legislation, but in listening to testimony, I don't know that we've captured that intent. And there's a lot of concern that we would be stifling innovation and actually stifling progress. Pushing pause on this, giving it some further thought and seeing as we move forward, maybe during the next interim, if something like a voluntary registration process and classification system is going to be something that simultaneously provides some regulatory protection while being more of an incentive for development. So I concur with you on that. Anyone else in the committee want to share your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Okay, so if we are not moving it forward, I don't have much. I think if we look at this down the road, The first thing I would look at is that there are no penalties and no enforcement considered in this. And one of the reasons you register in a state, if you're a company, is so you can sign contracts in that state, have employees in that state, and own property in that state. And without penalties or enforcement or any type of those sorts of activities, this essentially becomes a voluntary registry. And I don't know, the attorneys on within the committee may dispute that with me, but in my mind, I'm not going to help or suggest a client register in a state unless they're going to do one of those three things, or have some sort of brick and mortar facility within that state. So I think it's unworkable as is. And then beyond that, I agree with much of the testimony, Mr. Kaufman's testimony, that this would stifle innovation within the state, or give us a reputation that we don't want, or at the very least begin to deteriorate the reputation that we have. I know we have a great reputation right now for fostering the innovation, but this is something that I think would hurt that, with no real gain to the state at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pope. And I don't think it was a bug that it doesn't have a strong enforcement and high fees. I think that was an intended feature. It was trying to collect information and provide that communication pathway. So significant negative implications and outcomes. And the reality, as you point out, is it isn't very heavy-handed and wasn't intended to be very heavy-handed. It was a good step in trying to understand what was in place and what was operating. But I think the general sentiment is that even that would be potentially stifling, which if that's the feeling that it's a negative consequence, then as you pointed out, Mr. Co-Chairman, we probably don't want to go down that route. But again, there's not a lot of penalty in this particular bill, and I don't think that was an accident in the drafting of it. That was intentional to make sure that it wasn't looking scary, but I think it still looked scary in the end. So despite the intentions, it came out as a scary creature. Senator Furphy, Representative Singh, Representative Andrew, you comfortable with this direction? Yeah, all good. Senator Nethercott, we good?
I'd let you know.
All right, she would let me know. That is accurate. All right. With that, Mr. Coach. With that, we have arrived at, I believe, 1:30 p.m. on the agenda, which is our government data privacy bill. If I can find the agenda, what we called it. There we go. Data privacy. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, on this, we have a little update from the working group, which is basically just go over some of the conversation on data privacy. And there was discussion at the last meeting about the need to have two different types of legislation. One would be data privacy protection with regard to consumer protection and general public protection from corporations and corporate practices. And then another separate concept about data privacy with regard to the state, what the state is entitled and empowered to do. And we have before us at this point legislation to contemplate, which is still very rough, but hopefully we can hear thoughts and perhaps understand better the interest of the select committee for a draft for November. But I like the direction of how this draft turned out. And the idea is to effectively use data protection best practices with regard to the state of Wyoming so that you have retention requirements, potential deletion and correction in place, review, and then some have de-identified data when possible and provide some protection against surveillance and sale of government data or acquisition of government data, which is, as those who were in attendance last time recall, was a concern coming out of the northeastern part of the state that this legislation seeks to remedy. So anything else I'm missing for that on the overview, Mr. Co-Chairman? We can get Mr. Hopkinson to come up and walk through the draft next, but any opening discussion?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think you pretty accurately summarized just the nature of the dialogue that we've had. And to maybe elaborate just a touch further, a lot of it comes from the place of your data is your data. I think that we as co-chairs and certainly this committee tries to take a approach to protect your data, right? And obviously you mentioned the whole other half, which is the corporate part, which, you know, it's a different debate for a different time, but yeah, there's the state component, right? And if history has shown us anything, certainly at the federal level, what they do with your data, yeah, not great. And so I think having protections for individuals is really important. And I think that's something that I think this draft does a pretty good job in getting us in that direction. I'm eager to hear the debate.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Hopkinson, you want to come up and walk us through this 24 LSO 0107 working draft 0.3 that's available online on the Wyoming Legislature's website for those following along at home?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, walking through 24 LSO 107, working draft 0.3, data privacy state. This bill would create Chapter 21, which is data. So the first thing it does in this new 201 is create a number of definitions, and each of these are important. Much of this, the first definition there, de-identified data, identified or identifiable natural person, personal data, and personal digital identity. Those definitions actually came from the bill draft this committee had about 2 years ago. So first off, we've got de-identified data, which is data that cannot reasonably be used to infer information about or otherwise be linked to an identifiable or identifiable natural person or personal digital identity. And the government who possesses the data takes reasonable measures to ensure the data cannot be associated with a natural person or personal digital identity. So that essentially it just has to be is data that can't be tracked back to a specific person. Paragraph 2 specifies that the identified or identifiable natural person is a natural person who can be readily identified directly or indirectly, either by reference to a name, identification number, specific geolocation, or online identifier. And then personal data is information that is linked or reasonably linkable to an identified or identifiable natural person or personal digital identity, specifically excludes de-identified data or publicly available information, and provides that publicly available information is information that is lawfully made available from federal, state, or local government records. And the government identity here is a key definition and policy consideration for this committee. It specifies that it means the state and all its political subdivisions, agencies, instrumentalities, and institutions, and any local government entity. And then specifically excludes the judiciary or any law enforcement agency. So in essence, what it's getting at is a government entity is any government organization, state, local, whatever, throughout the state of Wyoming, except for the judiciary or law enforcement agency. I want to pause for just a moment on law enforcement agency. That term is defined differently throughout statutes. This, as drafted, it does not have a definition. That may be something for the committee to consider on, just to clarify what constitutes a law enforcement agency. But this particular part of the statute, there is no set definition for that term, which is not uncommon in the statutes. moving on to the next article there, we start getting into the requirements of what these government entities have to do. Subsection A requires that every government entity that collects or retains personal data requires them to adopt, enforce, and maintain a policy regarding that collection, access, retention, security, and use of personal data, and make sure that that's consistent with all applicable federal and state laws, including this new article. And so that's just requiring that they have to adopt a specific policy that addresses these. Subsection B provides that no government entity shall collect or maintain more personal data than that's been talked about in the past, that's all they can collect is what's reasonably necessary, and that the data that they do collect shall be necessary for a specific predefined purpose, tying back to that policy that this bill would require them to adopt. Subsection C requires that no government entity purchase, sell, trade, or transfer personal data without the express written consent of the natural person, except as otherwise expressly provided by statute or executive order. So some heavy policy questions here as well. It would significantly limit a government entity's ability to either purchase, sell, or trade, or transfer as far as how they can collect that personal data or what they do with it without express written consent, express statutory authorization, or an executive order. Subsection D provides or requires that no government entity shall maintain personal data for longer than 3 years without an express written policy identifying that retention period and providing a reasonable justification for that retention period. So if they don't adopt a time limit in their policy, it defaults to 3 years, but each government entity could adopt a longer time period. They just have to justify that within their policy and provide reasonable justification for that. Subsection E allows any Wyoming resident to request a copy of their personal data from the government entity or any government entity that's maintaining it. And the government entity may charge a fee consistent with the fees that you'd see in the Public Records Act. And F would allow that resident who objects to the accuracy, completeness, pertinence, timeliness, relevance, retention, dissemination, or denial of access to their own personal data, that they can file an objection with that government entity responsible for that personal data system in question. And the government entity responsible for that personal data system shall, within 30 days of receipt of the objection, investigate the validity of the objection. If it's found to be meritorious, they may alter the contents, the methods for holding, the dissemination or use of the personal data, or grant access to it. If the objection is found to lack merit, they may provide that resident with the opportunity to have a statement reflecting the resident's views, maintained and disseminated with that data in question. And they may notify or shall notify the resident in writing of any decision regarding the resident's objection. Subsection G this new article conflicts with another provision of state or federal law. That other provision shall control. In other words, if there is something that's more explicit about this data, that other statute would control how it's handled. Section 2 provides that any government entity that collects or retains personal data shall adopt any necessary policies and procedures to meet the requirements of this act not later than October 1st, 2024. So an adoption deadline for rules, and that would apply to every government entity. So the committee may wish to consider the timeliness of that if they want to set deadline, but for now, October 1st, 2024 is what's in the bill. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate the run through, Mr. Hopkinson. Any questions about how this bill is operating at this time? Co-chairman, any questions, any thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. You know, I know this is a little bit of a slightly rushed, maybe perhaps is the right word. And I really appreciate David's diligence on this and his work effort to get a pretty solid product, I think, out for us for review. I really wish we could make this apply to the federal level. Specifically FISA, but that's a whole nother, wouldn't that be nice? But back at the bill at hand. The only concern I kind of was having more language and deal. Okay, I'm a county and someone needs to pay the register, I'm a treasurer and someone needs to pay the registration in their car. I contract with a merchant processor to handle that type of stuff. I think this is probably already covered the way the wording is, but I might just be splitting hairs.
Yeah, on that, Mr. Co-Chairman, it seems that page 4, paragraph C, allowing for the express written consent of the natural person, except as otherwise expressly prohibited by statute, would allow that if that person were interested in engaging in that sharing or transfer of personal data, that would be an allowable action, but they would have to opt into it through that express written consent. So it seems that that becomes covered, but are there any cases that come to mind where that isn't going to be sufficient?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think it would, I guess, might be worthwhile to think this out through how it actually play out in reality. You know, the registrations expires next month on my truck. I go in, they say, well, technically we have to have express written consent from you. We're going to make you sign this disclosure form, and then we could process your credit card payment if you choose to pay by card. I guess the question would be just what does that look like practically in those types of scenarios, and all the other ones I'm sure we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, we'll give that some more thought. Committee, other thoughts? And one thing that just as a little bit of background for this legislation, there's clearly a great deal of flexibility for data policies depending on the government agency that's being affected, and with regard to data retention and what data you want to collect. You have to write down that reason if you want to be keeping something for longer than 3 years. And that's effectively the standard that's here. And then there are some citizen rights as far as review, correction, et cetera. And then the prohibition on the selling, trading, or transferring without express written consent. So I think it provides a lot of flexibility, which I think is important because this is broad in its applicability, and different entities would have different requirements. So this would apply to cities, towns, and counties. This would apply to University of Wyoming that we're sitting in. And they can write their data retention policy just about any way they want with this. It could appear relatively abusive, but that would be a policy. So there'd be hopefully some feedback mechanism in terms of review and scrutiny. It wouldn't be arbitrary. There would have to be some people sitting down and coming up with a reason why the data would be retained. You know, a good reason why somebody is keeping everyone's social security number, for example, maybe that would be discussed. And we know that there are still a lot of entities out there that have a drawer full of social security numbers and couldn't tell you why. So perhaps this would stop that. Perhaps not. The drawer full is hard to check. We don't know. I think that's the intent. It's trying to thread the needle a little bit to not be onerous while providing some pretty good protections. And I know that there's been a lot of interest in a bill like this because we haven't had strong protections in place, Mr. Co-Chairman. So anything that other members of the committee see here that maybe we need to strengthen or that we're missing, or perhaps to address Representative Western's concern written, and then we can obviously go to public testimony and get that soon as well. But before we go there, any key thoughts? I will say, oh, go ahead, Representative Singh.
Mr. Chairman, my thoughts are, if I'm just thinking of the scenario, if you were to say renew your driver's license and you didn't move anywhere for say 12 years, would that mean that you have to automatically that you would need to re-input all the same information that hasn't changed every single time you need to renew any document? And could you voluntarily opt into not having that be deleted? If that makes sense.
So as written, they would be required to delete it in no longer than 3 years, unless they wrote down a overseeing the Department of Motor Vehicles would develop a policy. We will retain ongoing license information for what's our renewal timeline? When do we have to renew by? Is it 4 years
That's fine.
or 5? Clearly, this is a priority to all of
Maybe
us.
7.
Yeah.
We don't know.
If their policy, though, that they write down is that number that we don't know, plus 1 year, for example, that's a good little policy. And they could do that, and then you wouldn't have to re-enter it as long as you renewed in a reasonable period of time, but they wouldn't keep your information if you didn't come back. No prohibition to that, so it's just sort of a rules of business type approach, but with a requirement that there be some level of justification in that instance. They might struggle to say, we would like to still literally do that. They just write the policy down, and then what is their justification? That might be something that could be challenged as unreasonable. There's not a lot of recourse for the challenge, but you could technically take that to a court and say that seems like an unreasonable abuse of what is a reasonable data collection. That would take some effort. Certainly, it wouldn't be an easy process, but it seems like, again, going back to our friends, the judiciary branch, if it was out of grounds, yeah, if you need it, then they'll rule one way. If they say, oh, that's totally an unnecessary and superfluous piece of data, then you might get a court decision, which is kind of the standard there that's intended.
And Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
If I might kind of just expand briefly on that as well, because I think it highlights two potential issues. One, if the licensing division, I'm not sure off the top of my head of its structure, but if it's under YDOT, is YDOT a law enforcement agency? Because they employ peace officers through the highway patrol. Depending on how that structure is set up, the way this is drafted, if they are considered a law enforcement agency, then they're not covered by this. If they're not a law enforcement agency, there still could be explicit statutes that apply. And I'm thinking here, there are licensing compacts throughout all 50 states that I do think have certain requirements on on data that they retain, so that they can see if someone's licensed in what state or where they've been, et cetera, et cetera. So those policies would take precedence over this if they are in conflict with this bill. But that's just two potential issues with how this is currently structured, or the committee may want to consider.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. And Ms. Hopkins kind of reminded me of something I think we chatted about a little bit. I think it might be worthwhile to consider wordsmithing that language on paragraph 5 on page 3, where it just says government entities shall not include the judiciary or any law enforcement. Perhaps changing it something along the lines of exempted from this, or the judiciary and any agencies, departments that perform a specific law enforcement capacity are exempted. So we can say, all right, troopers within YDOT, you're exempted, but the rest of you, or the rest of the agency, this does apply.
Yeah, that is certainly a point of concern. That last clause, we have to find a way to strengthen. We looked into it a little bit to see if there was any clearly appropriate definition of law enforcement agency that could be pointed to that would get to this delineation that YDOT is not intended to be a law enforcement agency for this purpose, but YDOT includes a law enforcement agency within it. The idea here being theoretically that the judicial branch or judiciary branch and law enforcement agencies are governed deeply and hopefully sufficiently elsewhere in statute. This is a hard question. Why would Why would YDOT not claim they're a law enforcement agency and that they're not beholden to it?
You know, I think the simple answer to this is to ask the colonel or YDOT, but for a number of reasons. The Wyoming Highway Patrol is separate and apart from YDOT, even though it is for administrative purposes dovetailed in there. But for example, the director of YDOT cannot ask for an FBI NCIC criminal background check. The colonel can, because they're law enforcement. They have the required credentials that way. And so I do think that that's there. If we want to specifically hit the issue concerning YDOT, then say, limit it to law enforcement agencies and the Wyoming Highway Patrol, excluding YDOT.
I think that's just an example more than it is the only case. The Game and Fish is another circumstance, right, where you have Game and Fish has law enforcement agents. Those law enforcement agents they're not even in a different agency. I don't think in any capacity, are they? What's our org chart with Game and Fish? I think they're law enforcement agents within an agency.
You know, I can't speak to Game and Fish with specificity, but you know, the question would be, do they have access to criminal investigation information? Or are they firewalled out? And if like employees of YDOT don't get to know criminal investigations
Right.
being conducted by the Highway Patrol, they don't have access to crash reports. They can't go into the system and do what they need to do. And so that's the delineating piece there, I think. So probably with some more, a quick question to them about how they differentiate themselves. But I think law enforcement agency for our purposes now is more than sufficient. I mean, if YDOT was going to try to take that they are that they are a law enforcement agency and therefore not subject to this law, I'd like to see them try to make that argument.
Fair, but
Or we can just button it up right now.
yeah.
But
Well, I don't know how though. I mean, so we can talk about it. We can look at it during the next. Thing to point to. Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I would just invite them to speak to that issue, or we can send them an email and ask them for some clarifying language that they feel comfortable with.
What is an agency from a statutory standpoint? Does an agency have very specific organizational meaning, Mr. Hopkinson?
Mr. Chairman, I'd have to double check on that.
It's inconsistent throughout statute.
Yeah, inconsistent throughout statute. Handy.
And my reasoning for some of the concern was simply some of the definitions for law enforcement agency essentially say an agency that employs a law enforcement officer. And so that would account for potentially YDOT, Game and Fish, the Gaming Commission, the Attorney General, which and that one specifically, I think generally would be considered law enforcement or in the sense of you know, I'm assuming that this should include, you know, prosecution. Do we have, if there's a disagreement there,
Yeah.
let's clarify.
Senator Nethercutt.
Right, so there's no attorney generals that have access to law enforcement records like that, like a local prosecuting attorney does. At least I'm not aware that there's any AG, even in the criminal division, that has access to.
DCI within,
D-
isn't that under the org chart of Attorney General?
Correct.
Yeah.
But the attorney generals don't have any
Right.
access to any DC. And really that org chart is only the director to the appointed AG.
Right. So, I mean, we really are looking for those that are law enforcement, engaged in law enforcement practice, not just the agency level. So maybe there's a way that we can fine tune that, and maybe we'll get some ideas through public testimony, but I think we all understand the intent. Well, except for that last bit. Any thoughts, representatives, Senator Furphy, on that? No, good. All right. anything else in the, that we want to discuss in the bill prior to getting public comment and things that we might want our public comment folks to focus on? All right, let's start with public testimony. If we have any from our public, first of all, from the state agencies, anything from our state agency. Please. And again, please introduce yourself, even though we know you from earlier.
Yes, thank you. My name is Zachary Weiner. I'm the CTO and founder of VX Technologies. Am I free to begin?
Yes, please.
All right, great. Honorable members of the Wyoming State Legislature. First of all, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you here today. I appreciate your work tremendously and that you lead the state of Wyoming and the lead the state of Wyoming has highly technical issue. Please allow me to reintroduce myself. I'm Zachary Weiner, founder and CTO of VX Technologies, which is a company that makes tools for everyday people, much like yourselves, with no tech background to save and validate records on a flavor of Bitcoin. Our company works with universities, police departments, and our products have been used by federal contractors for the DoD and DLA. But most importantly, our products are made available to the general public. It's not often that I'm in a room like this where everyone knows Bitcoin, crypto, and blockchain. This committee focuses on technology and blockchain, and my testimony business registration in the state of Wyoming is moving to a public ledger. Often we hear that Bitcoin is heralded as near perfect money because it embodies several characteristics. First among them is decentralization. Unlike fiat, Bitcoin operates without a central authority, ensuring that no individual actor holds unchecked power. There's a fixed supply, which creates provable scarcity. So at 21 million units, there's a safeguard against inflation that we don't see with fiat. And the third and most important point to this testimony is security. Through its use of cryptographically secured transactional framework, it's computationally improbable and probably impossible. That's one of the things that makes it such hard money. Interestingly, Nouriel Roubini, one of Bitcoin's most notable critics, described BTC, Bitcoin, in testimony to our national legislature as no better than a spreadsheet or a database. And while he intended to provide a critique of its monetary role, this inadvertently a storage facility. It's clear that the same qualities that make Bitcoin an exceptional form of money, decentralization, not relevant to inflation, and hyper-secure, render it an exceptional platform for data storage. In February of this year, just 7 months ago, Bitcoin saw a breakthrough. That breakthrough is called inscriptions. Inscriptions make use of a theory called ordinals theory, but that's no matter. The principle here is that using ordinals theory and inscription, you can allows us to use Bitcoin as near perfect data storage, in much ways the same as its near perfect money. At first, we were able to store small pictures. This might have been 16 by 16 or 32 by 32 pixels. These are tiny. So for the reference of the committee, that's about the size of the icon at the top left of one of your browser tabs. If you have a browser tab open and you see that there's a logo in the top left of one of those browser tabs, that's usually about 16 by 16 pixels. Today, just 7 months later, people are storing entire interactive websites on the blockchain. This is just the beginning. The Bitcoin network's capacity for data management is unmistakably expanding. This trajectory suggests that a future where an array of records, including user records, find a permanent, immutable existence on Bitcoin. It's this very feature, immutability, that underscores the importance and urgency for stringent privacy measures. Once on chain, the data is unalterable. Permanence deserves and maybe even demands extreme prudence. This is no more true than in the example of personally identifiable information on chain. Some leading cybersecurity courses at top universities across the globe advise against biometric ID on devices that you don't own, that you as a user are not in control of, and that you, the user, do not have the ability to delete. So for example, the fingerprint or Face ID on your phone never leaves your phone. You have the ability to reset the device back to the factory settings, effectively deleting all of your biometrics. On the other hand, banks like Wells Fargo and its competitors ask their customers to create a voice print or a voice-based password, and we, the users, have no ability to delete or remove the voice print from their database. Control with the blockchain and its pristine data storage capacity. When thinking about printing or pairing biometric identification with crypto or Bitcoin, I must emphasize the irreversible risks associated with the immutable data storage. Another example is that the founder of OpenAI or ChatGPT recently has been promoting a cryptocurrency that gives away free coins to anybody that registers in what's called an airdrop. This sounds great. It almost sounds fair and equitable, but in order to receive your coins and sign up, you must scan your retina in their device. The company claims the scan is safe and secure, but it's storing your bio to your ability to spend your money. Whether or not this retinal scan is safe, it sets a terrible precedent. More to the point, while companies may start with good intentions, the end result is often bankruptcy, where customer data is considered an asset that's able to be sold in dissolution. But there is a silver lining. Data hashing and cryptographic signature algorithms are the solution. Hashing transforms data into a fixed value size. So put simply, whether you start with a few words or a massive Tolstoy novel, at the end, when you run it through a hashing algorithm, you get a small string of letters and numbers. A hashing function will always spit back the same amount of letters and numbers for any input that it's given and will be entirely unique for the input given. So the few words that you've chosen will spit out a different hash. You'll always get the same hash back, no matter if you did it the first time, the second time, the third time, or the millionth time. It always has the exact same hash. So hashing can obfuscate data. Signatures are the other component, and signatures work much the same way as hashing, but with the added benefit that we can confirm or affirm the authenticity of a message's author after obfuscating the content. Signatures, like in the real world, can be validated to prove which Bitcoin or blockchain account wrote the record in the first place. In this example, Tolstoy doesn't have to carry around his manuscript, the unpublished version. He could simply carry around a cryptographic hash and a signature to prove that he is the author of this book. Luckily for us, Satoshi saw this as a possibility, and Bitcoin comes with a standard signing mechanism called Bitcoin signed messages. With Bitcoin signed messages, one can prove that the address owner, the signer of the data, was who they say they are, without divulging the original content. So the original content of a document remains hidden and obfuscated, and we can still verify who wrote that information, be it a government agency or a private entity. With this, I'm going to make a pivotal assertion. Signatures, we can redact sensitive elements like names, emails, while retaining the ability to authenticate the original content. Such an approach guarantees transparency, trustworthiness, and privacy all in one fell sweep. In closing, I entreat this esteemed assembly to consider legislation that meticulously guards against hasty publication of sensitive information like personally identifiable information to the blockchain. By marrying Bitcoin's transformative attributes with stringent privacy measures, we can chart a course towards a more trusted and trustworthy society. Thank you. I now yield for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weiner. Any questions? Go ahead, Mr. Kutcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weiner,
lacking some statements. And from my understanding, this is very specifically focused on government, where from my perspective, I don't think the bill should focus specifically on government, although that may be a caveat in a series of subsections. But I do believe that the restriction for personally identifiable information to be added to the blockchain extends well beyond government entities. And that could be government contractors, people who are associated with government. That could be municipalities, right, that are not the state government, but it also applies to everybody who operates within the state. So I do think we are missing some coverage here for people or actors who are not necessarily directly employees or agencies of the state that should be covered within this.
Mr. Co-Chairman, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Are you talking just about corporations in general that harvest, retain our PII, or are you talking about vendors and contractors that work with state entities?
Mr. Weiner, go ahead.
So I think referencing to this bill, this would be vendors and contractors who deal with the state directly. My personal opinion is that it should extend to consumers as well.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
I certainly agree that it should apply to larger just corporations in general. I think we've got some folks here who certainly have an opinion on that, but we'll keep it within the scope of this bill. And that was something I think we did discuss about, well, again, these vendors, whether it's a merchant processor or the like, they're not government entities, but still retain a lot of PII about our citizens.
Mr. Co-Chairman, that the intent of this focusing on the government specifically is not just because we think only the government needs to have policies like this, but it's because it's easier, honestly, to control what the government can and can't do, since we govern the government directly. There's a lot of desire, I think, for another piece of legislation that goes into the nuances of private sector and tries to establish appropriate property rights and privacy rights and gets into name, image, likeness concepts, personally identifiable information. There's a lot more challenges there where we can just directly say to state government entities, you need to have a policy and it needs to achieve these things. So it's sort of a one bite at the time approach. Now, that said, Mr. Weiner, what I'm taking away as perhaps a direct recommendation for this bill is on page 4, we've got some provisions of what government entities should and shouldn't do. And you've got, I'd say after paragraph C, which suggests, or I guess after paragraph D, which suggests that government entities shall maintain personal data not maintain for longer than 3 years without an express policy, either having an additional sentence there or having an additional paragraph, which says under no circumstances shall any personally identifiable information, or I should say personal data. What do we call it? Personal data. Under no circumstances shall any personal data be stored in a permanent form, such as on a blockchain, permanent immutable form, which seems perfectly reasonable and is consistent with what I'd say is best practice and government interest. So that's down the center of the plate of this particular piece of legislation, and I think consistent with your interests, although your interests I understand are broader. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. I would raise one question. We happen to be in a university setting at this moment. Under this legislation, is the university bound by the code as well?
And Mr. Chairman, yes, the university, the colleges, they are considered in Wyoming, not in all states, but certainly in Wyoming, it is a division of the state. Any further questions for Mr. Weiner? Seeing none, thank you very much. All right, additional public comment. Do we have any more in the room? Draft 0.3, data privacy state. I see Mr. Lindholm joining us. Come on down. Please state your name.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tyler Lindholm. I'm the State Director for Americans for Prosperity here in the state of Wyoming. Appreciate the legislation. I think our organization would like to government reform and government transparency, and I think this bill attempts to do that. I say attempts though, because really what we're trying to do when we're talking about transparency and reform is addressing practices that injure citizens directly. I can't say I look directly through this legislation and see specifically that. So if we're talking about how citizens have been injured directly by their government in regards to data privacy, several instances come to mind in the state of Wyoming. I think probably the most notable big thing that happened was during COVID, where the Department of Health had a data breach where hundreds of thousands of records went out. And so would this legislation fix that? I don't know. Yeah, Chairman, to your point, no. And so that's part of the concern. I guess, Mr. Chairman, when looking at this. And then also, Mr. Chairman, if you go to page 4, on the bottom of page 4 under E, we have some prior experience with legislation that took into consideration inmates and their housing. At the time, it had to do with concealed carry and stand your ground. And there was a concern that would stand your ground or the castle doctrine protect an inmate, or allow an inmate to do that. Well, under E, any Wyoming resident may request a copy of the is a Wyoming resident. Does that go against Department of Corrections? I don't know. I don't know how to consider that. Also, Mr. Chairman, on page 4, subsection D, no government entity shall maintain personal data for longer than 3 years. To Representative Singh's point, who brought up his driver's license, I think that even bigger situation could be health records, as far as the maintenance of those health records and what kind of policy is already in place on that. Is this just going to be an extra checkbox that government has to do in order to make legislature comfortable with how they're operating? And maybe that's a good thing to have that checkbox in place. But for me, it just makes more government bureaucracy, which slows down things quite a bit more. Not for or against the legislation. We're for government transparency. We're for the restriction of government. To Chairman Western's point, I don't think you need, I do actually think you could slip the federal government in this by restricting the lease or the sale of any property for the purposes of surveillance or the storage of individuals' personally identified information in the state of Wyoming as held by federal government agencies. You could certainly do that in this legislation, and that would be more pointed. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lindholm. Questions for Mr. Lindholm? Mr. Lindholm, I have a couple. One, from the transparency standpoint, being able to request information, although the inmate question is an interesting one, which maybe we'll dig into a bit more, but on the E paragraph, the concept there is a transparency concept. You know, what does an agency have about you? You should be able to see it. You should be able to correct it. You should be able to object to it potentially. It seems that is a consistent theme with what you expressed as being a theme that needs to occur with government transparency. So can you provide a little more nuance to that discussion?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great point. When it comes down to the legislation, we do want transparency. We do appreciate, especially on page 5, subsection F, Wyoming, it lays out how an individual can object and what they can expect. I think it probably goes a little too deep in the rest of it as far as how that's carried out. I think that agencies can probably figure out how to handle their business unto themselves without FI and FII and FIII. But
those are Romanettes 1, 2, and 3.
Mr. Chairman, I went to Sundance. Yeah, government transparency is important, but also for the sake. And right now, it seems like this is creating just a higher hurdle that could be more of an impediment versus what we are currently seeing.
Would you, I guess, what would you suggest to strengthen it to the point where it, in your view, becomes worthwhile?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I think you could probably pare down the legislation to 1 to 2 pages. Rob existing definitions that I suspect are from your prior work on the data privacy task force are already in law, and pare down the legislation to essentially F.
So, Mr. Lindholm, one of the concerns really is the C paragraph calls out the idea of buying and selling personal data of Wyoming residents. It seems like that's one of the core interests, is that the government shouldn't be selling personal data or buying personal data about citizens of Wyoming. And I think that's one of the interests that has led to this legislation. Is that, I mean, is that something that we should be supporting, the government of Wyoming transacting with your personal data?
Mr. Chairman, I think if you were actually worried about that, you'd remove the exclusion from the law enforcement agency so that the Wyoming Game and Fish could stop selling my data.
So on that point, that gets to the law enforcement agency aspect of it, where Game and Fish, are they a but that is an interesting circumstance where, and it may be the only example that is currently happening in Wyoming. To my knowledge, it is. But that's not to say it's restrictive, where Game and Fish sells your personal data, and this legislation can be addressed towards that, because again, that's not in a law enforcement capacity in any way, right? That is marketing for cash. So should we have that? Because that's kind of the purpose of the bill, is do we want more of that, less of that?
Mr. Chairman, if that's the purpose of the bill, then let's pare it down to just that. Everything else is, I suspect, something that's already being done by every agency, even the small little road districts have policies set in place that are pretty well demanded by county attorneys throughout the state. Now, granted, Mr. Chairman, don't let me stand in the way of progress of holding government accountable. I fully agree. I think you can pare it down and be more pointed as far as what you're trying to get at. Essentially, I don't think that legislation is here right now.
Great. Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Lindholm? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Mr. Lindholm, so when you say we should pare it down just to paragraph F and just have that recourse option, you are eliminating any sideboards whatsoever that we could potentially be placing on state agencies. Are you okay with state agencies who are not elected and accountable directly to voters?
Mr. Lindholm. That's not loaded.
That's not loaded at all. Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Co-Chairman, I know you know me better than that. Absolutely not. And like I told the chair, your co-chairman, I see the intent, and I think it's a good intent. I just don't believe that this legislation gets to what you're attempting to do due to the amount of other things that are in the legislation that do not rise to the occasion and just add more bureaucracy.
Follow up, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman, so adding more bureaucracy, and in doing so, would that be preventing these agencies from performing the services they're supposed to?
Mr. Lindholm.
Mr. Chairman, that's essentially, I do think we get into the weeds in these types of situations where the legislature prescribes so much on good intent, well-intended legislation But we prescribe so much that we end up falling into these traps where we actually create an even bigger barrier to access for individuals to be able to access the services of their government. And that would be my concern when we get into Romanets 1, 2, and 3 under F. You can see how that would be fairly easy for a agency like Department of Environmental Quality or Department of Transportation to be able to handle. But we are also talking about here the little road improvement district that has 5 members. And so that extends. And I think that's when things get weird.
Mr. Co-Chairman, anything else?
No, Mr. Coach.
So one concept along those lines that I guess is not explicit in F, but it is explicit in a couple of places above, is the idea that a government entity doesn't have to collect and maintain personal data most of the time. And if they are collecting and maintaining personal data and they want to hold it for more than 3 years, they need to sit down and write a policy. I guess the question then is, how is that an unreasonable bureaucratic barrier that if they're going to have your personal data that can be linked back to you, that they have to have thought about what they're going to do, what they need, and why they would need it. And that's the only obligation, and then have a process to accept challenges to it, where at any point they can just say, all right, maybe we don't need personal data, or maybe we need to minimize that personal data, not hold as much, not collect. It's like, well, if you want less work from this legislature, keep less data about the public, which to me gets back to, I think, what some of the interest that you were saying a few minutes ago. And that's how this is crafted, is trying to provide that incentive that it's extra work. If you're keeping extra data, you'd better have a reason.
Chairman, if I had a big marker right now, starting on page 5, to go to your point, to do exactly what you just said, on page 5, starting on line 11, after question period, strike the remainder of the line, strike line 12, strike line 13, strike the rest of the page. In fact, strike line on page 6, lines 1 through 9, and just let each agency handle their business as far as what was said in F above, which I think is your real meat and potatoes of the legislation, because that information for Romanets 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 are all designed around the ideology of kind of a larger agency, whereas some of these smaller agencies,
Sure,
this would be hard for them to be able to comport.
Mr. Chairman, no, I take that. That is consistent with that. I would say, though, you referred to on page 6, lines 7 through 9.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Yes.
You would take those out also? I think you wouldn't.
No, Mr. Chairman, I at 4.
That's what I assumed.
Yes.
Thank you. Further questions from Mr. Lindholm? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Lindholm.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your input. Additional public comment in the room? Seeing none. How are we doing online? All right. I see Daza up right now. Let's go to Daza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the Select Committee. I want to just express my general support for this bill. I do think it addresses a critical issue for personal data and for privacy, and when it's in the hands of government, I think the need for personal data rights doesn't go away. I think it still applies, and it should apply. And I appreciate the legislature's proactive approach to protecting Wyoming citizens' personal information. People are indivisible, and whether our personal data is in the hands of private entities or public entities, irrespective of that, I think some minimum set of expectations and rights and control ought to adhere to us. And given the flows of personal data between public and private sector entities, I think the need for some consistent set of reliable personal data rights, such as those in this bill, is all the more poignant. I also want to recognize that the explicit mention of what I would call authorized agents in section 921-202F is particularly commendable. The section allows individuals to object, quote, through a duly authorized representative, end quote. And this, it's a small few set of words, but I want to call attention to their power and importance. I think it empowers individuals to choose to work through an authorized agent. And this is significant today where managing our data rights can be very complex and very time consuming for individuals. Earlier today, just on that point, there was a fairly major release of the data rights protocol version 0.9. And that 0.9 is the one that's going to be deployed between companies and authorized agents. And the protocol it's a technical and sort of business process standard for authorized agents and organizations to streamline and simplify the process of allowing individuals to execute their basic personal data rights that are provided under the law. In this case, it's tuned to California Consumer Privacy Act, but it's the same basic set of rights to, access your data, correct your data, et cetera. I think the role of authorized agents really enhances the practicality for exercising these rights by individuals. And also having a standard like this makes it faster, cheaper, and more effective for the organizations that have to comply with such laws. So I do applaud the forward-thinking, very practical approach to recognize authorized agents that's reflected in this bill. Having said that, I'd also want to suggest some potential further refinements or revisions. One of them relates to having a sort of designated system responsibility. By that, I mean, the bill could further benefit from a requirement that each governmental entity kind of designate a person or at least a role for each system that contains personal data subject to the law. Someone who would be accountable for ensuring the compliance with the bill's requirements. This would be similar to a provision in Chapter 66A of the Massachusetts Fair Information Practices Act that is very similar to the bill before you today. Having a designated person responsible can help ensure that there's clear accountability and oversight for executing the requirements in the policy. It's one thing for a government agency to write a policy, and it's another thing to really live it out in practice. And having a person by name can help connect those dots. I'm thinking of my own time in state government when I say that. Another point is relates to the defined data rights. So the bill does an admirable job of providing Wyoming citizens control over their data. It doesn't seem to explicitly include the right of deletion. It sort of indirectly does. And I would like to suggest the Select Committee consider explicitly including the right of deletion along with access and correction and the others. In subsection F, there's the right to individuals have the right to object when personal data lacks in part its pertinence, timeliness, or relevance. And this kind of gets to, I think, indirectly the sort of criteria where if personal data no longer has pertinence, relevance, timeliness, then perhaps it would be appropriate for it to be deleted, even within the 3-year or whatever the time limit is. But then if we read further to subsection F2, that kind of outlines what would happen when an individual's objection is found to have merit after an investigation. It says if the objection is found to be meritorious after investigation, then the agency shall, quote, alter the contents of or the methods for holding or the dissemination or use of the personal data or grant access to it. I don't hear deletion in there, or I don't hear what happens when it's not pertinent or relevant exactly. So I think it's a little bit of a mismatch that could benefit by being more explicit about a right to deletion. Unless that's not the intent of the committee, in which case I'd love to understand better with your tolerance why you would choose to leave deletion out. Another thing is access logging. When I think about what these rights amount to, I think increased transparency and accountability should be critical. And so I'd suggest the committee consider requiring some kind of logging by the agency that is holding the personal data. So the log would include when the data has been accessed, who accessed the data and when and why. These are also, this is a critical requirement in Chapter 66A in the Massachusetts Fair Information Practices Act. And, it's been debated and discussed at some length. It's also, like, I think Estonia is held out frequently as a model for personal data control by individuals, where the data is in the hands of the government. And that's another example where they log every time some other agency or some other entity or individuals has accessed the personal data, and person can see that. That's kind of part of the record, not just that they have the data, but what are you doing with the data? And so having a log like that could be very, very helpful. It could provide a better audit trail and discourage unauthorized access or misuse of personal data. One other thing that just came up from the prior conversation in this hearing relates to permanent records. What that catalyzed in my mind was the sort of essential records like birth and marriage and death records, registries of deeds. These are all records in the public sector. I'd have to look at the bill again to see which ones of those are and aren't in the scope. But there's any number of records that are intended to be permanent. And I think, while some rights such as deletion, shouldn't apply, I do think such records are essential public documents, and they're frequently treated differently from other types of personal data. And they're, what would I say about them? I think in general, I'm reacting now partly to the conversation that was suggesting maybe personal data should not be held in a system that is intended to be permanent and immutable. I think that may require more consideration, specifically juxtaposed to the times when we explicitly want and need records to be held in a permanent, immutable way. Not that there can't be amendments that point back to the record, like deeds that have chains in them, or people have a name change, that sort of thing. But looking at what the record was in an immutable way over a long period of time sometimes is just the right thing. So anyway, in conclusion, I believe that with some enhancements, the draft bill sets a robust standard for privacy and personal data controls and protections. And my intention is that the suggested new provisions or potential clarifications would further protect Wyoming residents and maintain their trust in the state's government entities. And they're all said with the intention of basically support of the direction of this bill. And so with that, I thank you again for your time, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Appreciate it. Representative Singh, go ahead. Question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenwood, could you elaborate a little bit more on the Estonia policy that you were talking about?
Mr. Greenwood, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Estonia is, I would use the word renowned for over a decade now, having a digital identity and a kind of personal data, legal and technical infrastructure for Estonian citizens. And part of that identity system includes the ability for citizens to basically log in and check out, for example, who's been accessing their records based on that log I just mentioned. Estonia is a small country. And what works in Estonia will not necessarily work even in a state such as Wyoming or in other contexts. But I do think it stands for the principle that the idea of maintaining a log of what's actually happening with our data is sort of inextricably part of what it means to have some kind of control over our data and transparency and accountability for it by those who hold the data.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. Follow up, Representative Singh, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenwood, how does the Estonia policy interact with other entities in the European Union? I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I'm just kind of grasping at straws here.
Oh, certainly.
Thank you, Representative Singh. Go ahead, Mr. Greenwood. Probably GDPR there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I used to know the answer to that, but it's been some years and things changed in Europe, and I apologize. I am not certain of the current status or its interactions with accumulating layers of European Union, potentially applicable rules and regulations. However, I know people that do know about that. And if it's useful to you and the select committee, I can make inquiries and share what I discover.
Thank you, Mr. Greenwood. I think that would be useful to see if we can find an answer to Representative Singh's question on that. Representative Singh, any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I bring that up just as we construct this, just as Estonia would be dealing with the European Union, we would be forming policy that deals with the rest of the federal government. So,
excellent. Thank you. Additional questions for Mr. Greenwood? Mr. Greenwood, just on a couple of points that you raised for clarification. With regard to the deletion aspect and the note on deletion, in discussion about the drafting, the alter the contents of seemed consistent with deletion while not explicit being implicit. There's certainly no reason not to include an explicit deletion if that would be like empowering for the legislation. I think it's consistent with the possible intent. Although the right to be forgotten is probably a little less pervasive in the government, there's going to be a lot of times when you can't get that deleted, but there certainly would be instances where past retention time, for example, there'd be some deletion. So that point's well taken. With regard to the logging, one of the concerns there is just the pragmatism of this legislation being applicable at all levels of government. So you have large agencies that are sophisticated enough potentially to do logging, but they would immediately tack on a footnote of a multi-million-dollar appropriation requirement to amend their system to allow that. So that would kill this bill. And then smaller jurisdictions, the small towns, where you've got, one person that's the sheriff. And they just don't necessarily have the capacity to have logging protocols in place. So I think it's an incredible aspiration. I would love to see that in place, but I think it's a challenge for implementation at all levels of government. What are your thoughts on that? I just don't know that we can achieve it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. Your audio cut out for a moment, but I believe I got the gist of the question. And it related to the practicality and sort of feasibility of requiring this type of logging at every level of government, especially with this smaller instrumentalities of government. in my mind, the order of priority for these rights is number one, to know what personal data is held about us by others. Number two, to be able to have access to it. I actually put access as the second highest, most important right. First, you have to know who's holding what, to even know what you could access. Immediately after that is deletion. And then after that comes things like the correction and the other stuff. I would put logging probably somewhere like fourth or fifth. And so if it turned out that logging was impractical and would kill the bill, toss it right off the lifeboat and save the more important ones, in my mind. If there is some feasibility, even in larger agencies or something that tends toward logging or something like that, my testimony is simply that it's very beneficial and it's recommended.
Understood. And I appreciate that. It certainly is an incredible aspiration. It would be very empowering for citizens to know when their records are being looked at and have a trail of that. So I concur. Additional discussion or questions for Mr. Greenwood? Seeing none, thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony as always, and appreciate your participation in work on these privacy bills and legislation.
Thank you.
Clarissa, who do we have in addition? Anyone else? Is Brendan out there? All right, let's bring in Brendan. Mr. Marr, welcome back. Please introduce yourself to the committee.
Hello, welcome. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can, Brendan. And we're always interested in where you are at any given time. You seem to have relocated. I don't know what that is behind you, but I hope you're safe.
That was great. No matter where I am, I try to, the desert, wherever I am, I try to make these meetings. I am Brendan Marr. I'm an MIT Media Laboratory alum, as you all know, and a computer scientist. I am on the digital identity and data privacy working groups. We worked up the original Data Privacy Act about a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, looking at every line in the California Act for about 9 months, and it was intractable at that point in time, and here we are. That's a little background, but I want to speak to two salient points and issues. The first is, first and foremost, regarding deletion and persistence. Certainly one of the issues when we talk about data, which I'll say it like this, okay? As we move forward into where we're going with computation and data and blockchains and information that will be related to blockchains as proof of provenance and all these kinds of things, the issue around data, which is in a decentralized storage, becomes very, very important because you can't delete it. So the solution to that is not so hard. The solution is that it be added to the statute. Any data that is in a decentralized database should be encrypted, and there should be guarantees that the keys are burned and that the data is not accessible. This goes along to the discussion of the week or these last 2 days, because it seems in a sense that all roads or a lot of roads point towards data trusts, and while they may not necessarily work for legacy systems, as we go forward, this idea of a data trust and going towards what Daza was talking about in terms of logging and responsibility and control over keys and all these kinds of things. It is this idea of a data trust that can potentially provide this service and fiduciary. I'll take questions, but I hope that is helpful.
Thank you. Yes, it is, Brendan, and I appreciate the concept of the cryptographically storing or encrypted storage. I wonder if that's even already consistent if we said, no permanent storage, no blockchain storage of personal data. where when you look at the definition of personal data that we have at that point in time, if that information were successfully encrypted and is no longer identifiably linked information to an individual, I don't think it qualifies as personal data. So I think that would be allowable. And we could simply say no permanent storage, something effective along those lines, of personal data, and achieve what you outlined, Brendan, as a potential solution. Any quick thoughts on that?
Oh, yes, I actually have the salient thought on that. I'm glad you asked. The reason why that doesn't exactly work is because in this decentralized future, right? Because I'll take one step back to say this clearly. Data is too big for the blockchain. And we've heard before that information is not stored, a lot of information is not stored on the blockchain, right? It's stored off of the blockchain. Well, where does it get stored off the blockchain? Well, it could be stored anywhere. It could be stored in a centralized database. That's fine. But if it happens to be stored in a decentralized database, particularly something along the lines of IPFS, or other protocols, which are a decentralized protocol, what happens in these cases is that the data, right, the data that you put up, you take your image, you take your name, first name, last name, it starts off as being one, then it's all one thing, right? But when you put it into this format of a decentralized data storage, well, some bytes go here to this computer in Uganda, and other bytes go to another computer in Paris, and they're just distributed around the globe. And you're not going to delete them because they're not on computers that anybody controls, right? That's the point of decentralization. So this idea of control, decentralization, have to be thought out together, right? Because you're just not going to be able to delete it. If it's out there, it just exists, and it's not going to go away unless that's not true entirely. These systems, they have in place, some of them have in place mechanisms to delete the data. The data can be encrypted. If you pay for that encryption, I'm talking about Filecoin, for example, but there are others. If you pay for that data to be encrypted, it will be encrypted for N number of, whatever. But if you stop paying, then that data loads in the network. Okay. But a lot of this stuff is, autonomous and automated. And, it's not as simply as saying, okay, just delete the data, right? Ultimately you don't have control over that because it's on these other computers.
Right. Okay.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
The point
We have to be a
is
little,
you can, just
have to be a little more nuanced.
Yeah.
Understood. Any further questions for Mr. Marr? Further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Brendan. Appreciate it. Once
Yeah, great.
again.
Thank you.
Any further public testimony online? Seeing none. Any other public testimony in the room? Seeing none. Public testimony is closed. Once again, committee, I'd point out the fact that the bill has not gone through the full review process, so we shouldn't be acting on it at this point, even if we were ready to, but it does seem like there's probably some additional changes that we would want to make consistent with some of the suggestions that were provided. Let's open it up to committee discussion to see if there's anything that the committee would specifically like to see in a draft in November. Any thoughts, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's some really good discussion, both in testimony amongst the committee that brought up good points. I do think a good amount of it was beyond the scope of the bill. That being said, I do think that there were getting some language that accurately reflects the nuance of the law enforcement component with some of those agencies. I think that's probably some just good solid work in the meantime that we had talked about. I mean, I think the good news is we have almost 2 months to work on this and continue to refine it. Like I said, let David go through go through the review process, but I still think it's worthy to advance and continue consideration of, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Committee, anyone else have any thoughts? Go ahead. Representative Furphy, excuse me, Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my concerns, and I think it's beyond the scope of this committee, but usually where we see our personal information disseminated is through an employee error. Either they send out the data inappropriately, or they allow access to the system through their computers by opening the wrong type of email, etc. So as I said, that's beyond our scope, but that's really where we see the majority of the data with our personal information sent out there. So I just thought I'd raise that issue, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, to some degree, that is within the scope of this because data minimization is an important part of data protection. And we know that the government takes in an awful lot of personal data and they don't necessarily have any good use for it, but they just keep it around because it's handy and they don't have any policies to get rid of it. And so it ends up languishing. And then when you have that breach that takes place eventually, a lot more information is released than they probably should have been holding. So this doesn't go perhaps as far as we should find a way to go to achieve that objective. But if government agencies and entities aren't holding information that they don't have a reason to hold, then we know that we're better protected than if they're just doing random fishing trips and you know, it's convenient for them to have an awful lot of additional data at any given time. So this at least provides that justification. So I think it goes a little bit in that direction, but that point is well taken that there's more that needs to be done to address that. Representative Singh, any thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, I know I'll be doing some homework on European policy, I guess. So
Excellent. Thank you. Senator Nethercott, anything that you want to see other than all right. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think we've got just a couple of things that we probably need to tweak. We need to figure out what to do with law enforcement agencies so that it reflects appropriately what we want on law enforcement agencies. Language, working on some language as what would be either end of D paragraph or before E paragraph that gets at permanent storage of personal data. And remember, this bill's about personal data, so it would be specific to that. It wouldn't be about recordation of property transfers or anything along those lines. Those we're recording already on blockchain. But there probably isn't a reason why this time frame should be binding all future time frames for recordation of personal data. We should be able to change our mind later, and you can certainly have long-term storage without it being in a permanent blockchain openly readable format. So we can look for a little bit of additional language there. I guess I'm curious about some follow-up discussion on the idea of inmates and whether that would be a concern that any Wyoming resident may request a copy of their personal data. Maybe we just do a little exploration of are there unintended consequences of that? And for completeness, so that we're reflecting the deletion right, even though it's implied, I think we should make it explicit in the two places, in the F paragraph and then in the F Romanet little 2 paragraph. We've had discussion about trying to thin down F by deletion of some of that paragraph. I think for November, keeping the language in place and then making sure we have a conversation about whether we want to scale that back and have the simplified process where we just say thou shalt instead of having an investigation, et cetera, makes good sense, because I do certainly take the point that that's well and good for our large agencies once again, but it's going to be a bit of a challenge if you're the one person shop that has to deal with it. So we can carry that conversation forward. Other than that, I think it's in pretty decent shape for us to move along and get it put through the LSO process. Mr. Hopkinson, any questions on that? It's about 3 points that we need to work up.
No, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the walkthrough.
Great. Anything further that I missed? All right. Then with no objection, we'll carry that forward to our November meeting with those revisions and perhaps some further refinement based on the discussion that we had today. All right, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think is that the end of our actual agenda. We've got general public comment probably coming up next. If there's any that we haven't heard,
That clears the deck.
that clears the deck. The deck is cleared. Committee directives. All right. I think we've gone through the action we need, but now
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm fairly clear on what we've got.
that's good to
headed the
hear.
Next one. That may not always be the case.
That
so
may
it's
not
nice.
always be the case, but we
Often
nailed it.
hasn't been.
Right, exactly. We nailed it this time. All right, committee. Any further thoughts? We'll go to open public comment in a second, but anything before we go there? Seeing none. Any general public comment that we haven't already hit upon that we want to go over today? We obviously will carry on these conversations later. Senator Ellis, hello. Hope all's well. Seeing no public comments. Public comments closed. And with that, we are adjourned until, tell us the dates and where we're going to be, Mr. Hopkinson.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, the next meeting is November 20th and 21st in Cheyenne.
All right, we'll see everybody in Cheyenne. Look forward to everyone joining us either in person or virtually. Thanks for the hard work, staff, committee. Good to see you all. We are adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. I'll be back in the saddle next time. Sorry for missing this time.